ThreatLocker Insights is going to be really powerful for us. I love the idea that it draws upon all the intelligence gathered across the ThreatLocker landscape. So we know, hey, is this an application that's been used a lot in the past? What's the risk level of it? We get that intelligence that brings us confidence in deploying for our clients.
Oh, wow. ThreatLocker Insights. This is one I'm the most excited about. Being able to see in depth what's going on at any point in time and using that data to make decisions that we need to make.
Patch management is one of the things that the industry's struggled with for years. The patch management coming from this platform is going to allow it to be done in an intelligent way, securely.
The ThreatLocker user store is going to be a game changer. Definitely need the ability to self-deploy pre-approved apps that already have built-out policies on an as-needed basis, especially for users that may not have been identified up front that they actually need that application.
Yeah, so for us, the user store is huge. When we first joined ThreatLocker, that was one of the first things we brought up was once an approval is put in for a request and a user has to wait around for a little bit, they just sit there and they wonder, what do I do next? Having that link in the approval box that says, hey, you are asking for a PDF viewer that may not be approved, but here's a list that already are. It just saves our time. It saves your guys' time. It saves everybody's time. It saves hassles, and it's already approved, already vetted, and everyone's ready to go, just like that.
The ability to have that approval for the web control, just like any other approval, is great because there's like marketing departments that need access to social media where they don't want the rest of the company to have access. You can actually allow social media just for one computer or a user or a group and still block it for everybody else. So having that granular control with that web filtering will be fantastic.
The new functionalities, I think, taken together provide a pretty unique value proposition. In cyber, I think telemetry, being able to deploy secure apps, being able to patch those apps, and then be able to get data enrichment is super critical. So now to see patch management, DNS, outbound requests, the App Store, and all the web data and telemetry and insights is going to be super crucial to be able to allow organizations to be agile and see single pane of glass.
We have a team in ThreatLocker called the Special Projects team, and I think it's probably the coolest team here because you guys get to play around with pretty much everything on technology, I think.
Yeah, we get our hands on a lot of stuff, so it's pretty fun.
So we're a technology company, so we have a lot of IT people, a lot of developers here, but most of those people have one specific job. And we decided last year to build a team that has no job other than to test cool stuff out, and most of this work gets shelved and thrown away afterwards.
Yeah. The exposure is great, though. It's honestly just having our hands in almost every piece of obscure tech, that sort of thing. It's been fun. So,
but a lot of stuff also becomes very important parts of ThreatLocker. So we'll do everything from testing machine learning up to figuring out how we can integrate with Office 365, and that's all comes from the Special Projects team. But this project has really been a bit more boring, and that is trying to figure out how to make Windows Server more secure.
Absolutely.
So I think we have a white paper that's going to be emailed out after this as well, but we're going to go through some of the things, and we're actually going to show hands-on, not full detail because we only have 45 minutes, but we're going to show you how to do some of these things in Windows as well, because it's one thing saying you should do this, this, and this, but people often go away and say, well, how do I actually do that? Because it's difficult. So Adam's going to lead, and he's going to show some stuff, and I think the first thing we're going to talk about is removing unnecessary roles. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so we kind of want to set the stage with some concept knowledge first, and it's really just removing unnecessary roles or features from our Windows server. So the whole idea with this is we're trying to kind of limit what our servers do. So for an example, Active Directory should only be communicating over Active Directory ports, and it should only be doing Active Directory tasks. So there's no reason why I should be using a web browser for productivity or anything like that, checking my emails as a server administrator. There's no reason we should be doing any of that on a domain controller, right? So,
and one of the nice things about this is sometimes it doesn't directly stop an attack.
Exactly.
But it makes the attacker's life more miserable, and that often buys you time. So if you've got an attacker on your server and they need to download IP scanner,
then yeah, there's nothing they could do basically. And especially if we're limiting the ports of like the communication occurring on the server, it kind of adds those additional roadblocks.
Okay.
So I guess just to pop over to my screen, one of the features, and just to break into it, as I mentioned, is there's no reason why we should have a web browser enabled. In some stricter environments, you might see something like where they will only allow internal internet access. So it's really only speaking internally. It's not reaching out externally. It's a bit more strict, but something good to do is to basically just disable Internet Explorer, right? We're on our domain controller. We don't need to browse the internet from here. So we just have a PowerShell window open, and we're just checking the status of Internet Explorer. So I'll hit enter here. It'll allegedly return some output. So we are actually already have it disabled. So I went ahead and disabled it already. So great. If you do this for the first time, it'll prompt for a restart, but the effective command to disable it would be disable Windows optional feature, Internet Explorer. You'd hit enter. You see this prompt up here, and it says restart needed, false, because it's already disabled, and that's basically it. You just disabled Internet Explorer. So.
And what's nice is you can actually go off and add an alert into your EDR to say if somebody runs this, we should create an alert. So if they try and enable it rather than disable it.
Exactly.
Because and then that gives you an indication that why someone wants to browse on my server. I can now go and look at the server and see if there's anything else suspicious going on. So and you've just bought yourself time.
Exactly. And you kind of want to keep your administrators in check by saying like, hey, this is what these servers are used for. Only stick to that. So another feature that we don't exactly need, and it's disabled by default, but in some cases you might have enabled it depending on your environment, is SMB1. So SMB1 was one of the exploited protocols in the WannaCry ransomware attack. Yes. So we absolutely do not need this. We want to stick to SMB version 2 or 3. So
or none.
Yeah, or none. If you honestly, if you don't need it, again, you want to remove those unnecessary roles and features. So in this case, we're going to kind of just do a command. Okay, as we see, SMB1 is disabled. It's disabled by default, so it's a good thing. And something we could do as well.
If you've got an older server, it's probably enabled. So depending on the age of your server.
Yeah, we're on 2019, so I think they kind of got smart at some point and started disabling some of this stuff. So what we're doing now is saying, okay, is SMB2 enabled? And it's true. So we're good there. And another couple of commands we could do is really just setting it. Let me cycle through some of my stuff here.
Set SMB configuration.
Yeah, so you can see the two here.
Very small change.
Yeah, the false is for SMB1, we're disabling that, and the true is for SMB2, we're disabling that. So it really breaks back into that concept, hey, we're trying to remove as much stuff from our servers. We're trying to stick specifically to the network communication and the roles that's necessary for it to run. So.
How about, I have 100 servers. I don't want to go and do that in 100 servers. Are there any better or easier ways of doing that?
So you can use ThreatLocker for a lot of stuff.
Really?
Yeah, I try to stray away from that. I wanted to stick to stuff natively to Windows. I didn't want to say, hey, look,
that's fine.
You can enable network control, and you can literally just...
But if you have Configuration Manager,
correct,
you can go into Configuration Manager and disable that.
Exactly. There's a ton of different scenarios you can do.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So there's a policy there called Disable SMB version 1.
Okay. So I guess, yeah, just to break into some more concept knowledge, we're just going to talk about the DHCP role. We won't be we can kind of like go into here. You'll see the DHCP role and stuff here, but really just talking about concept knowledge. So this networking stuff, it kind of breaks back into removing unnecessary roles and features. That alone is very broad. It's a very, most NIST mappings are relatively broad, but it kind of fits in the same thing. So with DHCP, we just want to reduce the scope of what we're allowed to give out, right? So if I have 100 devices on a network, I kind of want to stick to around that number for the available IPs. DHCP exhaustion attacks, they're probably relatively uncommon, but even then, limiting our DHCP scope breaks into microsegmentation as well. And we'll kind of go into that in a second.
I would like to. This is impossible to do and unviable, but if I had it my way, I would have our DHCP server set up so it will only issue IP addresses to certain MAC addresses.
Exactly.
Not viable in most businesses, but
Yeah.
really nice to have feature.
Yeah, those ACLs are super important. And again, some of the ACLs you can set up with ThreatLocker's network control. But in the case of at least what you can do natively to Windows, so let's just assume we have a DHCP role on here. One of the things you can do is, I think it's down here a bit. It's actually a best practices analyzer scan. So realistically, we should try to keep our roles limited. Again, if we have DHCP on our server, but we could just stick it on our firewall or our switching, why not use those layer 3 devices instead? But let's just assume that you need DHCP on your server. Something you could do is start a best practice analyzer scan, and it'll kind of tell you, hey, here's some things you can take a look at. So something I thought it was a neat little feature. But in terms of like reducing the scope, just to kind of break back into concept knowledge, we want to think of microsegmentation, right? We want to break our networks into smaller segments and then limit those segments to the workloads that are relevant to. So again, if I have my Active Directory on, let's just say a /29, we want to limit the traffic that kind of like comes in and goes out. So we want to stick to specific ports. And this really goes for all your network segments. So that's where microsegmentation kind of comes into play. So I guess an example of that, to break into it again, is we want to block direct workstation access to database servers while allowing communication to an application server, right? It's effectively more or less what you're doing with some of these roles.
Yes, and you can also do that obviously on the Windows firewall, but also on the ThreatLocker firewall, where you can have dynamic ACLs by using objects. So you could say, I'm going to allow port 3389 from the IT person's computer, but not port 3389 from the rest of the company.
Exactly.
Or if the only thing that needs to talk to your database server is your application server, you could say, I'm going to put it on a different network, or I'm going to just have a firewall on the application server that only allows communication from the IP address of a firewall on the database server that only allows application access or database access from the application servers.
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that kind of breaks into the next concept, which is the concept of a secure admin workstation. So what this is it's really just trying to limit the workstations that do administrative tasks. So if I'm connecting to my Active Directory server, I want to connect to it from a specific network segment, and that's the only network segment allowed to connect to it, and from a computer that is only allowed to do privileged tasks. So you kind of want to separate privileged task computers from productivity computers. So a lot of people, they might just use the same computer to RDP into their servers, and on that same computer, they're web browsing, they're susceptible to drive-by downloads, things like that. They're checking their email. You really want to like separate the productivity from admin privileges, right? So a couple of things or principles to note when you're creating a secure admin host is you should never administer a trusted system from a less trusted host, right? If I'm connecting to my Active Directory server, I want the computer that I'm connecting to it from to be pretty much the same in terms of security. So we want both of those to be secure. Another thing is you don't want to rely on a single authentication factor. Use Duo, anything like that, multi-factor. And most attacks, although they leverage malware and malicious hacking, you kind of want to keep physical security in mind, right? Sometimes we're letting third-party vendors into our server rooms. You want to make sure that, hey, some of these have, their password protected. We're locking them, things like that.
Auto-locking, incredibly simple thing to do. Again, through Configuration Manager, you can do it. Through group policy, you can do it. But auto-locking your computers makes a huge difference.
Exactly.
As a practice, it should be good to walk away from your machine and always lock it. We have a silly sausage Teams message that goes out regularly in ThreatLocker if someone forgets to lock their computer. But having that, hey, at 10 minutes or 5 minutes, if it's a secure machine, it's just going to auto lock. I like one of the cool things you can do is you can tie your Windows machine to your phone. So if you walk away, it will auto lock, which is a pain sometimes because but you get too far away from your machine and it locks. But it's a really good feature to have that locked, because if someone gets onto your machine as an admin, actually, I remember an MSP once, they came in on support. This is before the ThreatLocker EDR days, and they said they had a rootkit on their machine. And I was like, okay, why do you think you've got a rootkit on your machine? And support had said to them, we don't have a rootkit. There's no rootkit. We've checked all of your unified audit logs. There's no executions happen. We cannot see a rootkit. We had no network control on the machine. We just had allow listing and ring fencing. And there was nothing running from PowerShell. There was nothing running from the machine. This is before EDR days. And they sent us a picture of a screenshot from the EDR that said, before ThreatLocker EDR days, that there was a connection from a Russian IP address on the machine. It was very ambiguous. So I said, look, can you just open up the event log on this machine? They opened up the event logs, and there was like 10,000 invalid logins on RDP.
That's crazy.
From a Russian IP address. There was no one on the machine. So, but essentially, they were one password away from getting on this machine. There was no dual factor installed on the machine, and it was one of their level 3 engineers. Now, this is a 500 employee MSP, so really big MSP. The level 3 engineer had taken their laptop home. It wasn't secured. They'd opened up RDP on the home firewall so they could connect to their work laptop, and they had an RMM admin agent running on it. So you have this super powerful machine that can literally push malware out to 30,000 endpoints, and it's protected by one password with RDP open to it. So that IT admins machines that should be the most secure in the environment.
Exactly.
Period. If you want to play around with toys, do it on a different machine.
So working from home wasn't convenient enough for this guy. He wanted to work from somebody else's home as well.
Yes, apparently working from home was not convenient enough. And again, another reason, making sure you've got network controls on your admin endpoints as well as your service.
Exactly.
We do have a couple of questions if we want to throw them in. First of all, somebody, anonymous attendee said, I saw Adam present at Zero Trust World. This guy is great.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
So Chris has asked, is there a ThreatLocker best practice guide in the knowledge base for servers? We currently only use ThreatLocker on our workstations. We're looking to do servers soon.
Okay, so, and there is no one cap that fits all, but there are lots of suggestions and lots of knowledge base articles. What I would suggest is that you work with your engineer. It's actually really easy to use ThreatLocker on servers, because it's much easier to lock down a server than a workstation, because servers should never change.
Exactly.
And if they do, it's normally in a very controlled fashion. So what I would say is you should use it on your server. Some of the exploits or vulnerabilities we've stopped being exploited, or backdoors in some cases, that we've stopped on servers. 0 day, the Exchange vulnerability was a big one. Move it. SolarWinds Orion was technically a backdoor, but by ring fencing SolarWinds, we're able to stop it getting an instruction. So ThreatLocker on your server is incredibly important, and also incredibly easy.
Yeah, really straightforward.
Much easier to deploy. If you're deploying on terminal servers, or again, lots of terminal server deployments, or VDIs, there are some considerations depending on how you lay it out. So you should work with your engineer, because if you've got persistent golden images, non-persistent, session-based, redirected profiles, all of these mean, hey, you might want to create this policy like this, but it's really a good idea to put it on your servers. And this is going to give you some of the guides of what you should be doing on your server in general, and that will hint to where you should be using ThreatLocker. I think there's tips for ThreatLocker in there, is there?
Oh yeah, definitely. They're kind of scattered all around. So
Roxanne has confirmed that. She says we use it on our servers and it's great. Thank you, Roxanne. Brian has asked, can we get a list of the commands that Adam's using post-webinar?
Yeah, some of the commands are actually in the white paper as well. So I think it's going to be available after the webinar.
Somebody else has asked, would you recommend stopping using RDP and only rely on Azure Bastion?
It's something you kind of have to gauge for your organization, right? Depending on like compliance restrictions and things like that, you kind of have to navigate it yourself. Some people might be okay with RDP. Azure Bastion's great too, or they might simply use their RMM tool to connect to their servers. So,
I think the latter of those is the worst option, which is the RMM tool.
Yeah, it can get a little scary,
because you've got, so my opinion on this is, first of all, RDP should never be published on the internet. If you want to access your server from RDP, a VPN isn't necessarily more secure. I would use an RD gateway. I would put an dual factor authentication on that gateway, and I would also have that gateway closed all ports. So I like using dynamic ACL, so a network control, because you can set up. You could do it with RDP directly, but I just think you should always have a gateway with dual factor on it. So you could essentially set up RDP, IIS, have an RD gateway that sits in the middle. You put ThreatLocker on that endpoint, and you say that only these trusted devices, or the IP addresses of these trusted devices, and it will track those devices' IP addresses, and the port will be closed. So if there's a vulnerability in IIS, it can't be exploited unless they happen to be on the same network as you. And then you've also got that backup of, I've got the RDP password, I've got dual factor on the RD gateway. So, but I think any remote access you use is adding weakness. So the main thing is keep it closed from everywhere it's not needed. And keep it as simple as possible as well. If you keep it stupid simple, as they say, because if you can keep it really simple, the probability of it being exploited is small. When you think about RMMs or things like that, they tend to have a lot of complexities in them, which allow potential backdoors.
Yeah, they're very privileged too. So, they can run scripts, all sorts of stuff. So you kind of have to watch out for it. And that really kind of falls into micro-segmentation, right? Like you want to limit the network traffic to what you're connecting too. So especially with like something like RDP. So.
We had one customer who had their RMM configured so it couldn't do anything apart from during maintenance windows, which is quite cool. So they had a policy to literally kill their RMM, and it would kill running processes. And it would keep you trying to start, and it was during maintenance windows it would wake up again.
It's almost like a just-in-time access type thing.
Yes, so, yeah. I mean, it's not the intended way of doing it, but it's,
of course, yeah.
It's quite cool when you think about how can you reduce your impact from your RMM.
Herbert, I think you just basically answered this question: is how and what machine does one connect to the secure admin machine from? And does that not make that machine vulnerable again? I mean, network control is the answer to that question, really.
Yeah, it's really falling under micro-segmentation again. So
I don't think it's a remote machine necessarily, the management machine. It has to be a different machine to your machine.
Yeah.
And if your job is just an IT admin and you are really, really good at not doing other things on that machine, then it can probably be your machine. But if you tend to test a lot of software and you do a lot of other activity, have two laptops on your desk.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's kind of you can like virtualize it too. So if you want to use like specific virtual machines for a secure administrative host, and they actually have like a whole deployment guide on the internet. If you search simply just secure administrative hosts, you'll find a Microsoft article that kind of talks about, hey, here's how you can deploy like a physical setup, a virtual setup, so on.
I like the other way around, where you use a virtual machine for your.
Yeah, I think the virtual machine is a little bit better in my opinion, especially if you have like multiple admin users and they might have different roles or like a separation of roles where, okay, my network admin only needs to configure my DHCP or DNS on my server. He can connect to it from here.
But what I mean is have the virtual as your machine for other stuff.
Yeah.
So you have, because your physical host, if someone gets onto the physical host, they can get onto your virtual machine.
Exactly, yeah.
John asked an interesting one. Disabling unsecure protocols is a big part of securing a server, but how can you monitor for what could be actively using those insecure ports so you can address those issues before disabling the protocol?
I mean, you've got to have network monitoring on all of the ports. Network control in ThreatLocker does that right out of the box. So the moment you turn on network control, even if you've got no deny policies, it'll log all of your inbound traffic and outbound traffic in one central unified audit. But monitoring for that is really important. Using either ThreatLocker Detect or an EDR to create alerts. So, for example, if you have ThreatLocker Detect enabled and network control, it'll immediately tell you that you've got an RDP session from a public IP address. Yeah. Things like this are really important.
You just answered the second part of his question, which is, are there logs that show the traffic or a nice command that will output the IP of the port being used? Again, network control will give you all that visibility.
And if you haven't tried the new unified audit, it's really, really fast. Everyone's being migrated to it slowly, so you may not even know it's new at this point, but you get a lot more filter options, and it's really, really quick at showing those things. Okay, so I think we've got the next thing. We've talked about microsegmentation, secure admin workstation, password policy. Yeah,
so this is kind of a hot topic. I mean, most people should be trying to utilize passwordless authentication. In my opinion, I mean, you can't really get around setting a password, right? If I set up an account, I have to set a password. So in that case, we might as well set a password policy. So if we kind of jump over to my machine, we'll kind of go over the group policy. It's really just some standard stuff. I think Microsoft recommends a password history. right here.
Just a
we have
question on
24
this.
passwords.
In
Oh, yeah.
2003, and I don't know if this has changed yet, and maybe you don't know the answer, you could only set the password policy at the domain level. You couldn't set it at any other level. Is that still the case?
That I'm not too sure about. I'm sure you could do like a local security policy on
Oh,
like a
for the,
home computer or something.
oh, but I mean, for the computers, but you can't say this group of computers has, this group of users has a really secure password requirement, but another group has less.
I believe you can do it with group policy because you'll apply group policies to specific groups of computers or specific groups of users. But realistically, you should kind of be using the same policy across the board, and it kind of goes back into the concept of like if my tier 0 accounts should be just as secure as my tier 3 accounts and stuff like that, right? So, but I mean, really, you just kind of go here. It's under computer config, Windows settings, security settings, account policies, and then password policy. And here's where you can kind of set everything for your specific users. There's also some like sys benchmark. They kind of like outline a guideline for specific password settings. They don't really deviate too much from, some of the Windows ones that they recommend, but they are out there. And one thing to note too is Microsoft actually dropped a password expiration policy, starting with I think the update was 1903 security baseline. You can check that out. I think it was something along the lines of like it doesn't. They effectively said it doesn't really matter. So
Well, NIST has taken that approach that changing your passwords is, and I'm not sure how I feel about it.
Yeah.
I get the point that if you're changing passwords regularly, people are writing them down.
yeah,
And the argument is if you've got dual factor, if someone gets your password, it's not the end of the world. But also the idea of a password being out there forever
yeah,
is somewhat scary to me, because a lot of cyber attacks don't happen because someone broke your password and then they attack. Because if they did, changing your password's probably not going to help anyway. What happens is those credentials get sold on the dark web. So I'm not sure that I agree with NIST or Microsoft on this. I
Yeah.
think there's a point in time, especially if you're talking about domain admin passwords, I would tend to be recycling them at 90 days, 120 days.
Exactly.
But not indefinite, because it becomes tradable credentials that will be traded for years. And the moment you turn off dual factor authentication because Duo goes down,
Yep.
you're toast.
Yeah, exactly. If a Duo service fails or just fails to start or anything like that, then yeah, you're kind of subject to that as well. So
Now, I don't know if you've put this on here. One of the things that the features of group policy conditions was to disable password caching on certain endpoints or limiting the number.
yeah, I've seen some documentation surrounding it, and I think the idea that kind of falls back a little bit into secure admin workstations, especially like when it's caching credentials. You want to limit to where you're plugging these passwords in the event it's caching, right? So
Well, and the reason being is because if you try and attack an Active Directory server, let's say you've got an 8-character password, you can technically attack a password really, really quickly, but the Active Directory server isn't going to reply that quickly.
Yeah.
And you could end up with account lockout, so now you can't attack the password. But if you have a hash of the password on the local disk, you can now do a hash attack on the password, which means you're not going to get locked out. It's not going to have a slowdown. So reducing the amount of caching, obviously you can't reduce caching on a laptop that gets taken home because people need to be able to log in offline, but reducing it on servers is really a good idea. Reducing it on workstations that have access is a good idea as well.
exactly. And I guess just a kind of a concept knowledge, and I think this is something you actually recommended, Danny, is removing domain administrators from file permissions. And it's not necessarily to say like, okay, I have a singular user account that is able to do whatever with this file. You're really just removing groups. You kind of want to avoid broad permissions like that. So again, you're pulling things back a bit. So, okay, I have a file share, or I have a file structure that is being backed up too. So I really only want a service account to access it. I don't need like a whole domain administrators group to be able to access this, right? So
Yeah, and then read versus write is important as
exactly.
well. So if you have a backup that needs to be able to read everything, only let it read things.
Exactly.
I remember dealing with a ransomware case, and the entire business was encrypted. Their backups, all of their files, except one folder, which was their payroll folder. And the reason their payroll folder wasn't encrypted was because someone had made the decision to remove the IT admin or the domain admins group away from the payroll because they didn't trust them not to look up people's wages. But the rest of the company they had full access to. If they don't need access, if that group doesn't need access, it can
Don't give it to them.
just makes their life a little bit harder. Anything we can do to make
Exactly.
And yes, you can technically take control of the folder, but quite often when someone's trying to smash and grab and do a quick ransomware attack, they just run the ransomware. They don't check every folder permission.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of breaks in, I guess, something ThreatLocker can do as well as only allow application access to specific file shares and stuff for backups, things like that, right? So,
Yeah, I think that's super important.
Yeah.
Not just backup, QuickBooks database, financial databases, files, only allow Office to access your files. It just makes the attacker's life, if they do get ransomware to run, of course, if you're blocking untrusted software, if you've got these network protocols, it becomes very unlikely. But you always want to assume that they're going to get in. Let's just make their life a little bit harder. And the harder we can make their life, the more time we have to respond from an MDR perspective or from a security perspective, from a response perspective, but also the more likely they're going to quit because they can't make money on your account anymore.
And we're kind of mitigating the damage associated with it, right? So if we do need to recover in any manner, there's a lot less to recover from. So
A couple of people mentioned, by the way, you can use fine-grained password in Active Directory Admin Center, much more comprehensive than GPO.
Well, that's good to know.
Something I'll definitely take a look into. So
here's an interesting one, and this is relevant to the general conversation. What methods are available for securing remote support for a cloud-hosted server? Forget the second question. What are my options for secure email? What methods for securing remote support in a cloud-hosted server?
Oh, so and remote support could be remote access for support purposes, or it could mean remote support temporarily. I don't know if I like too many options, but I think if you're doing remote support, if I had to get someone on my server, I mean, any of the remote support, you've just got to watch what they're doing and be able to disconnect it and remove it afterwards. Whenever you're opening a remote access to your server, it's bad, so it should be temporary and it should be monitored. I don't know if you've got any.
I mean, then it really just falls back into it. Kind of breaks into a just-in-time access thing, and I know you can do that from like Azure VMs and stuff through the firewall. There's a just-in-time access, like something you can use, and you probably want to treat it similar. I know a lot of support technicians, they might I think it's called BombGuard, if I'm not mistaken, but it's an application that'll essentially install so they can remote into your computer. If you can avoid things like that, then it's probably best.
Have seen it used in ransomware attacks.
Yeah.
BombGuard, GoToAssist, LogMe and Rescue.
Exactly.
They're good tools. They're used for purposes, but they should be limited. They should be limited to the time you need them, and the policy should expire. If you're doing it from a whitelisting point of view, you should expire the policy automatically. So if you do forget to remove it, and also watch what they're doing when they're connected.
Oh, most definitely. So,
one other one, and this is again a more general one. Any method for limiting email usage on AD servers?
Block the internet.
Yes.
So, I mean, that is.
You could ring fence browsers.
That's probably the best thing.
Yeah, well, ring fencing browsers will completely block it. You could block, and you can use network control. Actually, if you're using ThreatLocker network control on your servers, you should block outbound traffic. We block outbound traffic on all of our servers and only allow what's needed. It's a real pain in the backside sometimes when you have to go and say, okay, I'm installing Duo. I need to allow a policy to allow communication out to Duo so that they can authenticate. But I can, if you think about most of the vulnerability exploits, like if you think about SolarWinds Orion, it needed to reach out to the internet. The Exchange vulnerability, it needed to download, or may not needed to, but in every attack we saw, it downloaded a malicious payload from the internet. Move it, downloaded something from the internet. If you can take away outbound internet access from a server, you change the game. It's so much harder for someone to file run an exploit, and most servers do not need outbound internet access. So just block it with network control on ThreatLocker, block it on your edge firewall. Very simple thing, costs you nothing to do, and can really change the probability.
Definitely.
I think you want to talk about
and
best audit policies.
I guess this is probably one of the biggest things I would say associated with servers and even just endpoints in general. You'll see a lot less noise with audit policies from your server because things aren't happening as much. So these are just some of the basic audit policies that we'll go over, and they'll produce events like successful login, failed login, a user account was created, a user account was locked out, things like that. And these are some of the events that people will ingest into their SIM tools to kind of say like, okay, I need to know what's going on my servers, right? So the basic audit policies, they're very broad. And these ones are under computer config, Windows settings, security settings, local policies, and then audit policy. And they're pretty self-explanatory. You can kind of just poke through these on a server, right-click, properties, and it also has an explain portion. So it kind of tells you exactly what's going on, right? So security setting determines whether the OS audits each instance of attempts to user right assignment policy, audit policy, account policy, or trust policy, right? It's all relatively self-explanatory. But if we break into the advanced audit policies, one thing I thought was kind of cool, and you can kind of package a bunch of different things together to say, like, okay, this is suggesting or at least an indication that someone could potentially be deploying ransomware through a group policy. So,
Modifying a group policy, really, really important one.
yeah. So if we break down to, I think there's 3 of them: audit directory domain service changes, audit process creation, and audit file system. So to start with, we'll go to DS Access, and this is under the same branch of Windows settings and computer config. So we're just going down to the bottom where it says advanced audit policy configuration. We'll hit DS Access, directory service access. And the one we want is domain service changes. So it'll be this guy right here.
And this does the group policy changes, yes? Software
Yeah,
deployment?
so if we go to the explain, it's really just changes to the objects in here. So if an object is created, deleted, modified, moved, or undeleted, it'll start generating these events. And again, yeah, we can use our EDR. We can ingest some of these into our SIM. So, if a GPO is created, linked, or modified, we'll see those events if we have this enabled, right? So that's one thing. So we can say, okay, a GPO was created. So if we go down to audit process creation, that would be in detailed tracking. And so what this is saying, it's really saying we'll just read the description, allows you to audit events generated when a process is created or started. So in this event, a group policy was created, and now a new process has have been created as well. And then we kind of want to audit the file system as well, and that is under object access, audit file system. And basically, these will generate events that will say an attempt was made to access an object, right? So if we package all of these together, we're saying, okay, a GPO is created, linked, or modified, processes have been created, an attempt was made to access an object, right? So we're kind of monitoring user attempts to access file system objects, things like that, or track access of deployment scripts, right? So
Couple of things to note here, especially with the Active Directory ones. When you turn these on, now if you've got a very large server, and in ThreatLocker we have servers that ingest hundreds of millions of logs an hour, we ingest billions in total. You got to be really careful when you turn these on, because you might actually take down your system.
You've literally just answered David's point, which is if you turn on too many audits, ADDCs can get overwhelmed and won't log other important events. Make sure to check for 521 events.
Yeah, so you've got to figure out what is the server. If you're a small business, it's probably it'd take a lot to overwhelm your server from these events, and it doesn't.
There has to be a better way. There has to be a way that I can see all these reads, writes, copies, and moves.
Yeah. So we'll get onto that one in a second. So, but if you're a small business, it's hard to turn on too much to take down your server. If you're a very large business and you've got thousands or hundreds of thousands of people logging in, then you've got to be careful. You've got to test. You've got to understand. We made a decision to log all SQL logins rather than just failed ones recently in ThreatLocker, and we went through a very rigorous testing process before we put it live. And there's a reason for that, because we integrate it with our EDR. And if there's a login using a privileged account or a write account even, it immediately creates an MDR ticket, and then our MDR team look for the tickets. They go and look for the change ticket, who's doing it, what are they running, and they interrogate them. It's like, but we ingest a lot of data. We do a lot of logins, so we were careful. If you're a smaller business, you could probably, these group policy ones aren't going to cause too many alerts. Individual file tracking can do.
Definitely.
ThreatLocker logs that anyway. So also a Windows process creations one up that gets logged. So if you're using ThreatLocker, we're going to log all of your file access in one central audit. And the nice thing is we'll log on the endpoint and the server, and we'll even log the application that's doing it. I think, I'm conscious on time, but you mentioned BitLocker, and I think this is one I've been putting on slides a lot.
Yeah.
BitLocker drive encryption.
So this is something I kind of thought was just a cool feature. So I was actually unaware of I guess it's called network unlock. So what you can do with BitLocker is on top of it storing these keys in the TPM, you can associate like a pin with it. So I need to enter a pin in order to unlock my computer to continue the boot process, right?
Okay.
So what network unlock does, I'm sorry, you essentially install a Windows deployment server role on your server, and you pair that with Pixie Boot. So what this allows you to do is basically remotely unlock your servers if that pin is required or anything. So it bypasses the pin, unlocks that, and you kind of added that extra layer of security.
That's cool if someone was to blue screen, say 11 million servers, and you didn't want to enter the BitLocker key.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing you could do. It's one thing you could do. Now, it needs to have similar network access and stuff like that. I think there needs to be 2 NICs with this, is because one needs to grab DHCP from the Pixie server. So it's a little involved. They have a whole guide on online to kind of deploy this, but it is something I thought was cool. And if physical access is a bit limited for you, granted, if you're hosting bare metal, you have to have some level of physical access, right? Whether it's someone you call or yourself going into these server
Dell,
rooms.
what's it called? Not support assist. On my mind's just blanked. On the Dell servers, physical KVM access.
Yeah. Just anything that would be physical access, right? So, and this kind of helps at least to like remotely unlock that. And it also adds that additional layer of security for the actual boot process. So
This is really important on your Hyper-V images or your VMware images as well. The amount of ransomware attacks we see, look, it's getting harder and harder to run ransomware, especially when you block untrusted software, you close down ports. But I would say we've seen too many incidents in the last year where someone RDP'd to a physical host, and RDP shouldn't have been open on the physical host to begin with, or they connected through some kind of RMM tool, and then they shut down the virtual host, mounted the hard disk of the virtual host, deleted all the security software, and started it. Just turning BitLocker on that virtual host means you can't mount it without the BitLocker key. So doesn't cost anything, but really, really important. It means you can't reboot into safe mode without the key. You're really putting yourself in control of that machine.
Exactly.
So turning BitLocker on in general, if you can do it through PXE boot, then even better. Okay.
There have to be other ways of doing this, Danny.
Doing what?
Protecting VHDs.
Well, there's also, but you should be using BitLocker, regardless to what.
Yeah, but you can also use storage control.
If you are using ThreatLocker, you can go in. There's a community policy to block anything from mounting your VHDs other than Hyper-V.
Correct.
And there's a lot of tools. Now, obviously, some of the things we didn't talk about is stopping untrusted software run on the server. It's a huge win. And you think about all of the exploits and the vulnerabilities. Quite often they involve someone running an executable they shouldn't, someone deploying something they shouldn't. So if you're not blocking untrusted software on your server, you should be. It's really easy. It's much easier than a workstation, actually, because realistically, you probably don't even need to learn from most servers because they run Active Directory, and that's all part of the Windows core. And you can just lock it down very, very quickly. I wouldn't say don't learn, because if you've forgotten something, it's a problem. Obviously, there's an ebook to download on this, which gives a lot more detail.
Yes.
We didn't. There's a lot more things that obviously we can't talk about in 1 hour, like blocking PowerShell, ring fencing PowerShell where you can't. Just general.
I think I go a bit into DNSSEC too, and that is a whole nother beast in itself. So
yes. So the ebook definitely worth downloading. There's a QR code here. Trust us, scan the QR code. I'm sure you can go to threatlocker.com.
Nothing bad has ever happened after somebody said, trust us, you can scan this QR code.
If it's not on the ThreatLocker website, it will be on the ThreatLocker website with a download link as well if you don't want to trust us and scan our QR code. I think, do we want to do any questions for Zero Trust World tickets? Rob?
I did yesterday's questions.
No. So for those who are at the first webinar, essentially every year we host a conference in Orlando, Florida. It's in February or March, so beautiful weather. I think it's
somebody asked that question today. Actually, when is it? When Zero Trust World 26? It's in beginning of March.
Yeah, ctw.com will tell you when it is. It's a really cool 3 days. Lots of educational sessions. We try and keep it we do have thought leadership, but we're trying to actually show you how to do these things as well, because everyone's telling you should restrict your server, but not how to do it.
Of course, yeah.
So I think Adam did a great session this year on hardening service?
Yeah, I did Windows security review and then Office 365 configuration. Both were it was good to do both of those, to be honest. So
So
it was a fun time as well. It was a great event.
we also have hundreds of laptops, teach you how to hack, teach you how to use rubber duckies, pineapples, things like that. And of course, it's a great event. We had some great speakers over the last few years as well. Like I said, we have another webinar on April 8th, I've just heard. So please register for that. And the ebook will be downloadable online. If you haven't done a demo of ThreatLocker yet and like to do a demo, you can go to threatlocker.com, I think, and just click book a demo. There may be a link in the chat as well. And I think anything else we need to wrap up with?
Nope. Somebody else said Zero Trust World is awesome. Can confirm. Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, guys. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, today. Apologies for our tardiness. Hopefully, our internet stays stable now.
Yeah.
And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.